Good morning, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. My name is Amy Moreland, and I am part of the Office of Policy and Strategy at the Tennessee Board of Regents. I'm joined this morning by my colleague, Lindsay Cook, who is also part of the Office of Policy and Strategy at TBR. As we get started this morning, let me begin by just extending a warm welcome to each of you. We hope you're all enjoying the We All Rise event so far this week, and we're happy to help kick off day 2 of the event with the early bird crowd. So thankful to all of you for getting up early in the morning to talk with us about data. This morning, we hope to share with you some ongoing research around placement into remediation at community colleges. Our goal for today is to share a bit of background and data about a pilot study that is underway to assess the use of multiple indicators of college readiness to place students into remediation. I'm seeing a note here in the comment that says some people may have trouble hearing. So if you are not able to hear us, I'm seeing some people in the chat say it's all good on their end. So if you're having trouble hearing us this morning, feel free to send a message to someone in the main chat back in the lobby page, and they may be able to help direct us to some assistance. I'm so sorry for that. I know this is a new platform for a lot of us. So if you're having trouble hearing, feel free to go back to that main page and reach out to Deanna Morris Stacy or others for help. Great. Well, again, so glad to have you here with us today. And as I said, our goal is to share a bit of background information about a pilot study that is underway this fall. And some of you may be already very aware of that pilot. Some of you may be teaching students that are affected by that pilot. And so what we hope to do today is provide a bit of background and help share some of the research that informed that pilot. As some of you may already know, multiple measures for learning support placement is the focus of a great deal of research by higher education scholars, and it's considered a best practice by many national organizations. However, its use in the TBR system and or across Tennessee is relatively new. So we'll begin today's presentation by providing a bit of background information about this concept. And then I'll turn things over to Lindsay to describe the research behind this idea, as well as some preliminary data from fall 2020. First, just as a quick bit of background, as many of you know and are very familiar with, Tennessee has been a leader in developmental education reform for more than a decade. Whether you start in 2015 with the system-wide implementation of co-requisite remediation at community colleges, or maybe you go back a little bit further to the statewide scaling of the SAILS program that allows high school seniors to address their math remediation needs before they even get to college, or maybe you go back even further. Our state and our system have been leaders in redesigning, rethinking, and reforming developmental education for a long time. And that decade of reform, or several decades of reform, have made a clear impact. When we track the success of students entering community colleges in Tennessee, we can see the evidence of that impact. The proportion of first-time students at community colleges who are passing key gateway courses in math and English, these are those courses that students take in their first year, like Comp 1 or college algebra or probability and statistics. When we track student success in those courses, we see that pass rates have doubled over the past decade. However, despite those really clear and significant gains, there's also research that shows the need for some continued effort in this area for a couple of reasons. First, nearly 2/3 of first-time students at Tennessee community colleges require additional remediation or what we'll call learning support in at least one subject area. And those numbers make it clear that the need for developmental education is both widespread and significant. Second, despite some of those noteworthy gains in gateway course completion for all students, we also see that some gaps persist, especially between white students and students of color, and we'll return more to that point in just a moment. Third, some rigorous research has analyzed the outcomes of that decade of reform and found that despite progress in gateway course completion, those gains have not always translated into higher graduation rates or improved long-term outcomes. But in particular, that second point we just discussed, that data shows the persistence of some really significant equity gaps. As you see here on this slide, students of color are much more likely to be placed into a remedial course than are white students. Among first-time full-time students in 2019, 81% of Black and African American students and 64% of Hispanic students were placed into at least one remedial course. And second, in addition to those differences in who gets placed into remediation or differences in preparation levels, we also see significant gaps in gateway course completion rates. Last year, about 41% of first-time ever in college students at community colleges in Tennessee attempted and completed a gateway math course in their first year. But among Black and African American students, that same rate was only 29%. So those equity gaps that we see here can sometimes be startling, but they can also motivate us to action and to having some critical conversations about what we could do to promote greater student success in gateway courses and beyond. If you think back to that decade of reform that we started with this morning, you may have noticed that much of Tennessee's attention has been focused on the ways that we deliver remediation. How do we provide effective, meaningful learning support to the students who need it? However, for today's presentation, we would ask you to turn your attention to a slightly different question of how students are placed into remediation in the first place. And here you'll see we'll sometimes use the terms remediation and learning support sort of interchangeably. As many of you know, placement into learning support or remediation is governed by a system-wide TBR policy, which allows for students to be placed into or out of remediation based on standardized test scores. Some students, especially adult students, are placed using tests like the AccuPlacer, but the vast majority of first-time students at community colleges, especially those enrolling immediately after high school, they are typically or historically placed using their ACT subject scores. For example, as you can see here, and as I know many of you know very well, students could be placed out of remediation for math by receiving an ACT math score of at least 19. And as the next slide will show, the majority of first-time Tennessee Community College students have ACT math scores below that cut point. Last year, which is the data you're seeing here from fall 2019, 64% of first-time freshmen who were enrolling within a year of high school graduation, those recent high school grads, 64% of those students had ACT math scores below 19. And that rate was even higher, as you see on this slide, for Black students, Hispanic students, female students, and low-income students represented here with that Pell recipients category. And so that existing placement system, the one largely based on standardized test scores, it has some advantages. It's pretty clear, straightforward, simple, and most students in that system are placed using a single metric. At the same time, though, there's a growing body of research that supports the use of not a single measure of placement, but of multiple measures of placement. And according to that research, we might be able to improve the accuracy of students' placement into or out of remediation by using more than one indicator of college readiness. This research, some of which is cited here, shows that students who are placed using multiple indicators are more likely to pass college-level courses than students who are placed using just standardized test scores like the ACT alone. While standardized test scores are theoretically objective, those scores are also only representative of a student's performance or preparation on a single day during a single test. And the research argues that other data might be more comprehensive or holistic in indicating a student's readiness for college level work. The most popular multiple measures approaches combine those objective standardized test scores like the ACT with something more comprehensive, particularly high school transcript data, like a student's cumulative high school GPA. Some institutions and systems have taken it even further. Some have developed complex algorithms that take into account a number of indicators. And some also factor in non-cognitive assessments like a student's mindset, as well as students' own self-assessments of their readiness. And they factor some of that into placement. As you can see here, the use of multiple measures for placement is fairly common. It's somewhat widespread. 19 states allow or require the use of multiple measures for placement. But interest in this idea in Tennessee was somewhat limited from our perspective, at least until recently. Before spring of 2020, this was an idea that I think people across TBR were aware of and were maybe considering somewhat cautiously or hypothetically. For example, Lindsay had begun thinking about the use of multiple indicators of college readiness and whether that might help address some of the equity gaps that we see or help improve the accuracy of placement into remediation to make sure that the students who need additional remediation get it and those who don't need it can proceed directly into college level coursework without remediation. And so we had done some additional research about what other states were doing or what this might look like in Tennessee. But again, it was all fairly hypothetical at that point. That is until about March of 2020, when it became clear that the COVID-19 pandemic might result in the fact that some students are unable to take or retake the standardized tests that often determine placement. When it became clear that some students were not going to be able to take or retake the ACT or take or retake the AccuPlacer test, the community colleges asked if there was going to be some alternative, if we could develop some other way to determine which students are placed into or out of remediation. And after some initial research, it became clear that high school GPA might be the most viable alternative option for placement. However, before proceeding with that idea, with using high school GPA as a method for determining who went into remediation or who was placed out of remediation, we wanted to first make sure that that decision was based on some rigorous data analysis about the predictive power of high school GPA for college success. And so I am now going to turn things over to Lindsay, who is going to walk through the details of some of that data analysis, which has led to a pilot study that is underway at community colleges this fall. So I'll now turn it over to you, Lindsay.
Thanks, Amy. Good morning, everybody. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lindsay Cook, and I am a research analyst at the TBR System Office. I wanted to thank you all again for joining us, especially at 8 a.m. We're going to get into some data, which I know you're all really excited to do this early in the morning. So before we start, as Amy said, early in 2020 and late 2019, we began to explore a multiple measures approach for placement, particularly looking at the combination of ACT and high school GPA and how that plays through success in college level courses. So we'd first like to share with you some of the early findings in math that informed the pilot of the use of high school GPA. So in 2018, as you can see, just over half of first-time freshmen passed college-level math within a year. So 55% made an A, B, or C. But what's really interesting about this is that regardless of their ACT score, of the students with a really low GPA of 3.0 or less, only a third passed their gateway math course. Similarly, on the other end of GPA, on the high end of GPA, regardless of their ACT score, of the students with a 3.9 or 4.0, 90% passed Gateway Math. So I'm going to break this out a little more in the slides that follow, but this is a high-level overview of what our early research started to show us. So what this slide is depicting is pass rates in college-level math course by a student's ACT math subscore. This is of first-time freshmen, recent high school grads. So as you can see again on the far left, that overall pass rate is about 55%, but it varies across ACT math subscores. Generally, as you can see through these red bars, as a student's ACT math score goes up, so does the pass rate. That gray line also represents how many students there are at each ACT score. And you can see that it peaks at 16 with just over 1,800 students. And there are fewer as we move left to right, but even at a 25, still about 350 students. So we felt good about the sample size for this analysis. So the next way we wanted to break this out was to take a look at their pass rates by high school GPA. As you can tell by that red line, which also shows how many students are in each of those GPA buckets, each group from 3.1 to 4.0 is roughly similar in size. There's just as many people in that 3.9 to 4.0 category as there is in the 3.1 to 3.2. But we can see that most students fall into that 3.0 or less bucket. The pass rates for the highest GPA group here is 90%. So students with a 3.9 to 4.0, regardless of their ACT score, were very successful in college level math. While if we look to the left, only 54% of students with a 3.1 to 3.2 passed college level math. And I picked that group for comparison because it's a similar sized group. So these success rates are even lower for students with a 3.0 or less, which, as you can see from that red line, as I mentioned before, is our largest group here. So really important to the multiple measures work, as Amy mentioned, is considering the combination of more than one metric. So not just looking at GPA or ACT alone, but looking at them together. So this visual shows students' GPAs when their ACT score is right around the cut point in math. So that cut point in math is 19. So you can see in the blue bars, those would be students with a 19 or above. So the different shades of blue are students who would not have required learning support with the ACT math cut scores. And those students in red, the two different shades of red, are students below that cut point. As you can see, there are some similar patterns as before. So overall, pass rates rise as ACT subscore rises, and it's easiest to see by looking at the group on the far left. So that overall group, students with a 17 passed at a 54% rate, and students with a 21 who are above that cut score passed at a 65% rate. There's a more significant increase or gap in pass rates across high school GPAs, which we saw in the previous slide. So if you focus in here on the dark red bar and the dark blue bars across the screen, a student in the dark red who has an ACT math subscore of 17, these students also who had a 3.0 passed at a 37% rate, but if they had a 3.9 or a 4.0 and a 17 on their ACT math, they passed at an 86% rate. You can see the same trend happening for students with a 19 or above. The students in dark blue here, they didn't require learning support, but those with a 3.0 or less passed at about a 41% rate. and those with a 3.9 to 4.0 passed at a 94% rate. So we can see here that the combination of the ACT math subscore and high school GPA tells us a lot about a student's success in their college level math course. So while pass rates vary, we wanted to dig a little bit deeper into the specific grades that students made in their college level math course. And we found that these also vary by the combination of ACT and high school GPA. So overall, about 16% of students made an A in their college level math, 20% made a B, and 18% made a C. About 1 in 5 failed their college level math course, and 16% either withdrew or failed due to absences. But most importantly here is that more than half of all the students with a very high GPA not only passed, but made an A in college level math, regardless of their ACT score. And on the flip side, less than 5% of all students with a very low GPA made an A in college level math, even if they had higher ACT scores. So we're going to dig into this data a little bit more, and I know this is a lot to process at one time, so I'm going to do my best to pull out some key takeaways from this slide. So what you're looking at is a breakdown of college level math grades by ACT, which is across the top, and high school GPA, which is along the left side. So again, I know there's a lot to take in here, but focus on the difference in the blue bars, the darkest blue, and the red, the darkest red. So those are the students who made an A and the students who did not pass. If we take a look at the top right square, students with a 24 and a 3.9 to 4.0, that dark blue bar represents all of the students who made an A. So we can see that across all ACT scores on the top row, the students with a 3.9 to 4.0 made A's at pretty high rates. The students, almost all students with an 18 and a high school GPA that was really high also made A's in college level math at high rates, though we generally think of the students with an 18 as being below that cut score. They are below that cut score, so we deemed not academically prepared for college level math. Also interesting to note here is the students with the low GPAs. So if you look at the bottom of the visual, you can see that these students with a 3.0 or less were very unlikely to pass their paired college level course. I also want to note here that for those students with the very low GPAs, a lot of them were not even attempting their college level math course in their first year. So a lot of these students did not even make it to college level math in their first year. So next, I wanted to talk a little bit more about the equity concerns that we looked at when we considered the use of high school GPA for placement. So for now, let's again take a look just at that top bar. This represents all students in that first-time freshman, recent high school grads group that we've been looking at. Those in red, again, had ACT subscores below the cut point, and those in blue had a 19 or above. Within that red bar, within the students who required learning support, you can see the breakdown of how many students had each GPA bucket. So you can see that most students who were below the math cut point had a 3.0 or less, and very few had a 3.9 to 4.0. So when we started to compare these to other bars, there is a larger proportion of Black students, which Amy highlighted earlier. About 89% of Black students fell below that ACT math cut score. And so I'm going to focus on that group for now. One of our concerns before the pilot was that adding GPA could potentially cause further equity gaps among these groups, Because if we said, okay, for all the students in red, if you had a high GPA, you don't need learning support. There were very few students in each group that had those high GPAs. And so while fewer Black students would be placed into learning support, it would still be a much higher percentage than the overall population. The same trend tracks here for Hispanic students, female students, and students who received a Pell Grant. So we thought a lot about this when thinking about the cut scores, but a larger proportion of the overall than the overall student population, Black students, Hispanic students, female, and Pell would be placed into learning support. So after these preliminary results showed the promising predictive power of the use of the combination of high school GPA and college level courses, combined with some of the concerns about COVID-19 testing, like Amy highlighted, we began to explore the possibility of piloting the use of high school GPA for placement in spring 2020. So in this section, I'll go over the details of the pilot as well as some very early enrollment information on who we think might be impacted by the first semester of the pilot. So this past spring, the board approved a pilot placing students using their high school GPA. This is in addition to those other placement metrics already in place, so it didn't eliminate the placement by SAT, AccuPlacer, or SAILS. The placement is based on cumulative GPA on a 4.0 scale, as long as their GPA is no more than 5 years old. At most colleges, that cut score is a 3.6, or higher. So 3.6 or higher places you out of learning support. 3 colleges sought approval to provisionally place students out of learning support at a 2.8. The pilot is underway now, and it has been extended through spring of 2021. So we are excited to start to dig into who could potentially be impacted by the pilot at this phase. So according to some preliminary enrollment data for fall of 2020, we believe that about 2,700 first-time freshmen, recent high school grads could potentially be impacted by the pilot in one or more subject areas. This means that the ACT scores of these 2,700 students indicate the need for learning support under the placement policy, but their high school GPAs are above the cut score used in the pilot. So just about half of all the students potentially impacted are in one subject area. So of the 2,700, 1,300 students could be impacted in one subject area. About 1,000 of those students are just in math. So math is definitely playing heavily through these numbers. About 650 students could potentially be impacted in 2 subject areas, and about 700 students in 3 subject areas. So as I mentioned, by subject area, the number of students varies. In math, the largest number, about 2,300 students. This means they had an ACT math subscore that was below the cut point, but a high school GPA that's above. In English, it was about 1,100 students and about 1,300 for reading. So for the sake of time, we focused again here on math, looking more closely at the 2,300 students potentially impacted by the use of high school GPA. So if we take a look first at the blue bars on the left, this is showing the distribution of high school GPAs of these students. Nearly 2/3 of these students had a high school GPA of 3.6 to 4.0. About a quarter had a 3.1 to 3.5, and only about 14% had a GPA of 2.8 to 3.0. So I'm feeling optimistic about these numbers based on the high school GPAs of these students, based on the historical data that we looked at. Students with these high GPAs are generally pretty successful in college level math. So we're anxious to see the results of their grades at the end of the semester. If we take a look at math subscores on the right in the red bars, this is showing the distribution of ACT subscores for these 2,300 students potentially impacted by the pilot in math. Interestingly, because of the distribution of ACT scores for these students, which we saw in previous slides, most students have a 16. Nearly 1/3 of the students in this group who could be impacted by the pilot have a 16, which is a few points below the math cut score of 19. But overall, 3/4 of all these students had an ACT subscore of 16 to 18, so not particularly low, which again makes me at least pretty optimistic moving forward. So based on what we've seen about the success of students with high school GPAs and ACT subscores, we're really anxious to explore these students' grades in their college level courses at the end of the semester. So finally, we have also begun to compare these students potentially impacted by the pilot to those who definitely do not qualify for learning support or do not need learning support based on the current cut scores, and those who definitely do based on our cut scores. So this slide is a breakdown of all the first-time freshmen, recent high school grads that had math subscores and high school GPA information. So on the far left in blue, these are what would be above the cut score in ACT and in ACT, but not necessarily high school GPA. So their ACT score waives their learning support requirement in math. These students will not be impacted by the pilot because they already have tested out and they don't need that high school GPA to come in and get them out of learning support. In the middle in gray, these are the students potentially impacted by the pilot in math. This is that 2,300 we've been talking about. These are the students who would have been placed in learning support under the previous placement model, but are eligible now to go directly into college level math under the pilot. Finally, in that red box on the far right, this is the group of students with both ACT scores and high school GPAs below the cut score. This means that they place into learning support under the old placement policy and the pilot. So as previously discussed, there are some equity considerations at play here, particularly for students of color. So when we compare the students who do not need learning support based on their ACT score, which are the students in the blue, the students impacted by the pilot, which are the students in the gray, are more likely to be students of color and female. So the no learning support students are 4% Black, 82% white, 7% Hispanic, and about half are female. The students impacted by the pilot are more likely to be Black, so 18% Black, 64% white, 10% Hispanic, and much more likely to be female, so 74% female. What's interesting about this to me is that the students in the pilot are very, very similar to those who definitely need learning support. So the gray and the red boxes are very similar, but they're still more likely to be female. So the students who definitely need learning support are 19% Black, 64% white, 10% Hispanic, which is very similar to the students in the gray box, but 60% are female. And the students in the pilot potentially impacted are 74% female. So we plan to continue to dig more into these numbers and start to understand the outcomes for students in the pilot, particularly focusing on the success for students in these subgroups. So in terms of next steps, there are a lot of things we would still like to know about the students in the co-rec and also in the pilot of the use of high school GPA. So we've received some grant funding from Strong Start to Finish to do research on co-requisite remediation over the next year. Strong Start is supported by Education Commission of the states, and they're focused on initiatives to improve student success in the first year. As part of this grant opportunity, Strong Start is also working with other systems and states who are focused on scaling interventions like CoRec. Our focus for this project will be on conducting quantitative and qualitative research on remediation efforts at TBR over the last 5 years, including the pilot. At the end of this project, we hope to use what we learned to begin thinking about how we might continue to refine these efforts, especially looking at those subgroups that we've been discussing throughout the presentation, and share some briefs and working papers for other states and systems interested in implementing CoRec. So if you're interested in learning more about multiple measures and co-requisite remediation at TBR, there are a few links we wanted to share with you. These slides will be posted under the Office of Policy and Strategy page on the TBR website. There's a link to our full research library here, which has a lot of great material on this topic and others that our team is working on. There's some links to system-wide analyses of co-rec remediation, our early analysis of multiple measures, which goes into some other subject areas besides math, more research on multiple measures, as well as Strong Start to Finish. So Amy, do you have anything to add? Is there anything I've missed? Otherwise, I think we're happy to take questions at this time. So if you have any questions, you can start throwing them in the chat.
Thank you so much, Lindsay. And thanks to all of you for joining us this morning. As I hope it was clear, there is still a lot of work to be done in this area, both as we think about how to refine the ways that students with remediation needs are met by our colleges, how they're placed into remediation, and as Lindsay said, some additional forthcoming work about how well those students do in co-requisite remediation. I see a comment, a question that has just come in from Wanda Grimes about how the current environment, which is, as Wanda says, certainly not normal, going to affect the findings. And I think that's a very great question. I think that is something Lindsay and I and others are beginning to think about. There's a lot that is going to impact these findings, whether it is that co-requisite remediation is in many cases now being delivered online. We're also seeing a change in the profile of students who enrolled at community colleges this fall. They are on average more academically prepared as measured by things like ACT or high school GPA than students were in the past. And in addition to all of that, just all of the pressures that are on students and faculty right now. So to answer Wanda's question, I don't know that we know yet how the current environment is going to affect these findings, but that is certainly something that we are seeking to understand better. And some of that will be done through some qualitative research that Lindsay alluded to, with us or others talking directly to students and faculty and staff who are experiencing this work during these really unprecedented times. Lindsay, anything you want to add to that question?
Amy, I think that was a great response. There are a lot of things at play here, as Amy mentioned, so that's definitely something that we're going to want to take into consideration and learn more about throughout our analysis moving forward.
Looks like one more question just came in. Jennifer asks, since most rising 11th grade students have not taken an ACT by the time they seek to take dual enrollment classes in their 11th grade year, having the ability to use high school GPA for placement was helpful. Do we plan to look at DE success rates as well? That's a great question, and that is also something that has been on our minds. And dual enrollment plays a special role in this work because, as some of you know, many dual enrollment students across the Tennessee Community College system are allowed or able to take dual enrollment courses based on their high school GPA. Many community colleges use high school GPA to help determine who is able to take dual enrollment classes, which is sort of separate or in addition to what we're doing here about placement into college level coursework. So dual enrollment certainly plays through this in some really important ways. And the short answer to your question, Jennifer, is yes, that we certainly plan to look at success in dual enrollment courses as well. We've got, as you can tell, a long list of things that we'll be eager to look at, especially once the fall semester concludes and we have some sense of course success rates that we can look at for many subgroups of students, including dual enrollment students. I see another question that's come in from Brad McCormick, who asks, do you see TBR expanding the measures beyond the GPA? You mentioned students' perceptions of their own readiness, and that is certainly something that we have thought a lot about, mostly looking at what other states have done. I'll try to give a quick answer to Brad's question, but then certainly want to hear from Lindsay on that one as well. So other states have looked at things like students' self-assessments or students' outcomes on like a mindset assessment. Others have also looked at much more complex algorithms based on many things from a student's high school transcript, more than what we're doing here in this pilot of just the cumulative high school GPA. So there are a lot of options that are out there that other states have experimented with. So I think we are trying to keep up with that research and see what other states have tried. But a guiding principle for us throughout all of this work is to, one, try to keep things fairly straightforward so that students understand why they are being placed into or out of remediation, and so that faculty and staff understand who is being placed into or out of remediation. And sometimes those more complex algorithms can take away some of the transparency that we think has been an asset to the placement rules that we've used so far. But there are definitely some interesting things out there, especially about students' own perceptions of their readiness. So it's something we're keeping an eye on. Lindsay, anything you want to add to that?
I agree. I'm also really interested in students' own self-efficacy beliefs, and does that play into how they do in these classes? As you said, Brad, you knew that you were underprepared, so does that impact how students perform? I also think Amy hit the nail on the head when she said we want it to be straightforward for students in the colleges. There are a lot of really complex ways that states and systems are placing students into learning support. And so it becomes a question of, does adding all of those additional dimensions actually improve the predictive power of what we're trying to do here? So I think it's sort of a balancing act between, we could have a really, really accurate, complex algorithm that would be pretty hard for students to understand and for institutions to implement, because they're trying to place students before they even come in the fall. So that's a great question, and one that I'll definitely keep in mind.
I see another question that's come in from Karen about, are we planning to share any information regarding learning support English and reading today? That's a great question. And Lindsay and I wish we could. In the interest of time, we said, well, we'll just talk about math today. The patterns for English in particular are fairly similar to what Lindsay has shared today about math. In general, the success rates in college level English are higher at all ACT levels and GPAs. So it's a very similar story as what we saw with math in English, but with just higher success rates across the board. We weren't able to get into the details about English and reading today just in the interest of time. But as Lindsay mentioned, if you go to the TBR website and navigate to the Office of Policy and Strategy page, you can see some of the data that you saw today, plus some of the same information replicated for English. And I think as we continue to assess this pilot, we're going to find some particularly interesting things beyond just math as we look closer at English and reading. So certainly more to come there. Well, we'll give a few more minutes to see if any other questions come up here in the chat. But these have been excellent questions. Thank you all so much for your time this morning and for being such a great audience. As you have a chance to let all of this data soak in or to explore the additional details that are available on the TBR website, we just so welcome your feedback. So feel free to reach out to either Lindsay or I or others who are part of the research team at TBR as you have additional thoughts and questions. We'll respond to any additional questions that come up here in this chat. So thank you all so much for being a part of this presentation today, and we hope you all enjoy the rest of the We All Rise event. Thank you so much. Are we done?